Hi, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone, depending on where you are. Welcome to our webinar today, Rights on the Line, Human Rights, the Price of Progress for Big Tech. We're really excited to have this discussion with you today and with our panelists. This webinar, as you would have already heard, is being recorded, and the recording will be sent to all registrants of this webinar and will also be posted on our website. Also, the links to all the different materials and the slide decks will also be made available to all registrants. There will be, after we hear from the panelists, there will be time for Q&A. So please do post your questions in the Q&A box provided. And we really want to have an interactive session and have kept almost 20 minutes at the end for Q&A. So please, start typing in your questions as they come to you. Just a quick introduction for those who might not know us too well. The Investor Alliance for Human Rights is an initiative of ICCR, a coalition of over 240 global institution investors across 20 countries and representing over 20 trillion in assets. The Investor Alliance has been leading on engaging on tech and human rights work since our inception in 2018. And over the past 7 years, our work on the tech sector covers convening collaborative platforms for learning, interacting, and engaging amongst investors, civil society, and digital rights organizations and experts. We've also published 7 tech sector briefings. These are salient issue briefings for investors who are engaging with tech companies. And we just published our latest briefing on AI and generative AI and the harms they pose on human rights. We also engage on tech and AI policy, bringing in the investor voice into discussions on relevant regulatory measures in the EU and in the US. And as well, we have been coordinating this investor engagement on digital rights and AI accountability, which we will share more as we go through this presentation today. In connection with our digital rights and AI accountability engagement, I've had the privilege to work with RDR since 2018 and have leveraged, and we together with the investors have leveraged their data analysis and expertise, and we've organized collective investor engagements of 26 of those largest global telecom companies. This webinar today marks the 6th webinar and benchmark report that RDR and the Investor Alliance have collaborated on together, and we really value the close partnerships and friendships we have cultivated. Now, a little bit more on the webinar, and you will see on your screen our speakers, but as technology becomes increasingly woven into every aspect of our lives, from how we communicate and work to how we learn and engage as citizens, the human rights implications of digital platforms grow in urgency and complexity too. Big tech companies shape our digital spaces, influence civic discourse, and manage vast amounts of personal data. And with that power comes responsibility and scrutiny. So today's discussion is anchored in the release of the 2025 Ranking Digital Rights Index Big Tech Edition, the 7th edition by RDR, which benchmarks the world's most powerful tech companies on their commitments to human rights, particularly in the areas of privacy, freedom of expression, and algorithmic or AI transparency. We'll hear from the Ranking Digital Rights teams about what the latest data tells us and what progress has been made, and where serious gaps remain. We will also explore how investors can use these insights to push for greater accountability and ensure digital innovation doesn't come at the cost of fundamental rights. Since 2021, investors informed by data from RDR has been pushing transparency and risk assessments with big tech companies relating to their use of algorithmic systems powered by AI, for transparency of mechanisms that enable the surveillance advertising business model, which accounts for close to 90% or more of revenues of these companies. But let's get to what we're here for and to really have our excellent panelists tell us more about the findings from the report. So we have today with us both Leandro Uchiferi as well as Samantha Ndewalana from the Ranking Digital Rights team at the World Benchmarking Alliance. Briefly, Leandro is the engagement lead for RDR and is a digital rights advocate with experience in this space of over a decade. And I've had the honor of working with Leandro over the last 3 years. Samantha is someone we've just started to working with, and she is the RDR research lead. We've already learned so much from her. In that role, she conducts in-depth research and data analysis to support the development of RDR's benchmark. So with that, let me hand off to Leandro and Samantha to take us forward.
Thank you so much, Anita, for that kind introduction. Let me just start the presentation here, just making sure that everyone can see that well. Yeah, it's a pleasure to join everyone today. Really exciting to be sharing the latest findings and data we have from the 2025 RDR Index. So before getting started on the RDR Index itself, I wanted to start with a quick recap about the sort of broader work that we do within the digital team at WBA. As some of you may know already, but especially for those unfamiliar with our work, we tackle digital rights and digital inclusion through two main research processes and research products. On one side, we have the digital inclusion benchmark, which focuses on advancing digital inclusion, which things like access, learning and skill development. And on the other side, we have the Ranking Digital Rights Index, which is the benchmark that we'll be talking about today, which focuses, as Anita was mentioning, primarily on freedom of expression and privacy. So it has a very deep connection to international human rights frameworks, which is one of the things that distinguishes the methodology compared to our focus on digital inclusion. So a couple of things that you'll find on the RDR index itself. We have a very strong focus on digital platforms and telcos. We focus on 14 digital platforms and 12 telecommunications companies. But more specifically and more interestingly as well, compared to other benchmarks out there, is that we focus also on specific services. So today we'll be talking about the digital services that are covered in the Big Tech edition. So it's the section of the research that covers these 14 digital platforms. And all encompassing, there are 43 services that we assess individually. So that means that for all the different indicators in our methodology, you'll find very detailed assessments on the level of transparency on these specific services. And I'll touch more about that in a second. This 2025 edition is the 7th iteration to date since the first publication of the RDR Index in 2015. And it's been 3 years since the latest assessment that we published in 2022. So we'll also get to see and share a bit more about what has happened in these 3 years. So more specifically about the measurement areas that you can find with the RDR index. As Anita already mentioned, we have a strong focus on these two very specific human rights, freedom of expression and privacy, but also there's a sort of overarching theme of corporate governance as well. So that's something that I'll be mentioning in a second as well. Before moving to the specific sort of indicators that you'll find, I wanted to also share a bit about the geographic scope of the RDR index. And here in this map, you can see the distribution of the companies assessed, both on the Big Tech edition and also on the Telco Giants edition. So all the companies in purple, you can see here the distribution of the digital platforms from tech titans in Silicon Valley and I guess the general West Coast of the US, all the way to Russian, Chinese, and other platforms in East Asia. And on the telecommunication side, pre-distributed as well across North America, Europe, and Asia. But again, today we'll be focusing on the big tech platforms. So before going into the insights of this edition, I also wanted to do a recap of the specific themes that you will find in the RDR index. So as I was mentioning, we start with sort of like an overarching assessment at the corporate level, at the group level of all of these companies, touching on aspects like human rights commitments, governance and management oversight mechanisms, human rights due diligence, which have more specific sort of sub-themes across different aspects, such as policy enforcement, regulations, and so on. Stakeholder engagement, so how companies interact with external stakeholders like civil society organizations, and of course, remedy processes. On the freedom of expression side, you'll find everything from access to policies, so the usual sort of terms of service or terms and conditions policies, to more detailed aspect about content governance, and that goes specifically to how companies may restrict or block accounts, for example, how they restrict content. So the usual sort of content moderation aspects are covered across different indicators. And finally, on the privacy category, you have everything from data handling, so how data is collected, what inferences are made from that data, how the data may be shared, and how data may be also disclosed to governments, for example, in the context of governmental demands for user data. We also touch on aspects like digital security, so things like the implementation of encryption for communications, and aspects about vulnerability disclosures and data breaches disclosures and management overall. Also worth highlighting, and my colleague will also touch on this in the findings of this edition, are some really interesting set of indicators that are sort of distributed across the three measurement areas, which touch on algorithmic system development and use, and targeted advertising and advertising content more broadly. But we'll get to what these mean later in the presentation. So before getting into more sort of like details on the key findings of this year's edition, I wanted to first start with an overview of what has changed since the previous iteration. So on the left side, you'll find a chart with the scores from the 2022 assessment, which basically counted on data from 2021. And on the right side, you have the newest chart, the newest ranking of the Big Tech edition with the recent assessments. So a couple of things to mention. Well, a few changes to highlight that we introduced in this edition. You'll find the newest sort of assessment of ByteDance, as we have officially included the company in this iteration. Some of you may be familiar with one of our like in-depth mini research explorations that we did in 2021 when we assessed TikTok and Douyin, which is the Chinese mainline equivalent of TikTok from the same company, ByteDance, on a subset of indicators. And you can still access that online, but now is the first sort of like proper index when we have included the company fully assessed with the whole set of 58 indicators from our methodology. So we're really excited about what this enables in terms of new comparisons and new sort of like contrasting in different areas that my colleague will also cover with the key findings in a bit. So that's one thing new and exciting about the RDR index. Another aspect also worth flagging, it's the rebranding of Twitter to X. And when we evaluated Twitter in 2022, that was before the acquisition from Elon Musk. So now another also really interesting aspect that is enabled by our new data set are these sort of like comparisons between the pre and post acquisition. And we'll also touch on this in a second. Also, some overarching aspects that you'll probably already start to see through just this new ranking is that although scores are slowly increasing, especially from the bottom half, there's still quite marginal progress. And although Microsoft has taken the top spot this year with getting it to the 50% mark in terms of overall transparency, there's still few that a lot of these companies can really boast about. So I think stagnation has been overall the main theme that we are sort of like digesting as we continue going through the findings and sort of like the granular data. So without further ado and going into too much detail, I wanted to pass it over to my colleague Samantha to take you all through the specific key findings and yeah, share more insights from this edition. So Sam, over to you.
Thanks, Leandro. Yes, perfect. So as Leandro has outlined, there is a lot that has changed between 2022, when RDR had its last iteration, to now. Some changes that happened in 2022 include Twitter's change from Twitter to X. But more recently, there are a lot of geopolitical changes that are taking place that are having big impacts on how US companies or Chinese companies operate, that are having impacts on regulation related to AI, privacy, and other areas within the tech ecosystem. And so our results touch on all of that, while our key findings touch on all of that, while diving deeper into RDR-specific data as well. So the first key finding looks at the performance of US companies. So like Leandro had said, we do see some improvements across the US companies as a whole, with the exception of X, of course. But even with those improvements taking place, the jump in those improvements isn't comparable to, for example, the Chinese companies. I'll touch on that in a moment. And so this shows us that even though the tech companies are leading currently in areas like privacy, and in this graph on the slide, you see that on a service level, in some areas like social media, video sharing, or search, the US companies and their services are still in the lead. Even that being said, they are stagnating. So compared to Chinese companies, the jump isn't as big. And this, along with some of the other data that we've had a look through, is showing us that the tech giants are moving slow. They're not fixing things. And they've come to a place where they are comfortable in their leadership role within big tech platforms globally. This is an opportunity because that indicates that there's still scope for interaction and engagement with these companies in order to push them in the right direction. So this shows that there is a gap for corporate accountability to play a role, and for investors specifically to play a role, because these relationships that some of you might have with the companies are long-standing. And so engagement is one of the ways we can move them towards action, towards moving slowly, towards fixing things and not resting on their laurels. Next slide, please. So with the Chinese companies, what this graph is showing us is how they compare to some of their peers in governance. So here we've seen Chinese companies improving, particularly when it comes to their transparency around governance. So related to human rights impact assessments, related to things like human rights commitments, for example. So looking at this, one thing that's important to note is that while Chinese companies have had a big jump, it doesn't mean necessarily that we find them in our data now leading the governance area overall. The size of their jump is also related to the fact that they're starting from a lower base. So historically, in our assessments and overall, Chinese companies weren't as transparent in terms of governance. And this is a particularly important story to share in this space, that there are a number of things that have happened over time in order to make this change. But one of them is external pressure, external political pressure, but also external pressure from investors and market forces that have shown these companies the benefits or the positives to improving disclosure. So we see that increasing transparency in this area is a strategic response from companies. And again, that is another signal that there's room for corporate accountability in this space, as engagement with these companies from investors, from other civil society organizations is having an impact in the governance space. So that leaves the door open for continued conversations on governance, but also on freedom of expression and information and privacy. Next slide. On private platforms, here in this graph, we see how two of the private platforms that we assessed in this iteration, ByteDance and X, perform relative to their peers in governance. And one of the mechanisms we see here is an overall lack of transparency, because the external pressure mechanism doesn't work as well on private companies. They aren't listed, they don't have that pressure, the same amount of pressure from investors or shareholders. And so they're able to follow their own chosen path with regards to transparency on governance, freedom of information and expression, privacy, and in other areas as well. However, one of the things that RDR stands by is that being a private company and not having to disclose doesn't mean that disclosure shouldn't take place. It's important for companies to be transparent, especially companies of this size. They are global, their impact is global, even if their business model might be private. And this means that there is still an important role for investors to play, particularly with X, for example. So the case of X formerly being a public company and now being a private company means that the company has done this before. They've been transparent about a lot of the things that we cover in the assessment before. A few slides ago, Leandro spoke about how, as Twitter, they performed quite well in the assessment. So their capability is there. It's been done before, but as a private company, they are backsliding on that responsibility. And so there is room for investors, civil society, and other interested stakeholders to hold them to account for the impact that they have on their users around the world. Next slide, Leandro. this key finding touches on the big tech business model. So the big tech business model is fueled by algorithms that use a lot of data, a lot of user data, in order to be able to keep people on the different services. And when people are on the services, then they can be targeted by advertising. In addition, something that's also important to note, given the current ecosystem, is the important role that algorithms play in AI. And we've seen that companies, more and more companies, are pushing to get involved in AI, adding AI to various products and services that they offer. Algorithms are like the key that run the AI engine. And so it's very important to have an understanding of what companies are doing in this area and are doing in targeted advertising, because of how that then links to their business model. And we see that there's no opting out of the business model. Companies are not being very transparent. They're not disclosing whether users' data is included in algorithms by default. And some of them are not disclosing whether they are whether they've conducted human rights impact assessments on their targeted advertising. And even further, they aren't disclosing whether there are options for users to opt out of the algorithm. And so this leaves this area, algorithms and targeted advertising, as a black box. Next slide. And so all the data is publicly available online. We, along with our executive summary and our key findings, as Jan said in the chat, we will be sharing more information about the findings coming up soon, and we'll keep in touch with everybody around that. I am now going to hand over to Juana, and later on, just before the Q&A, we'll go deeper into how to use the data, how to access the data, and so on. But for now, let me hand over to Juana.
Thanks so much, Sam. I'm just jumping in to just introduce Juana, and we're really happy to have Juana Lee with us, Associate Director of Corporate Engagement at Share Canada. We're really thankful for her experience. She has led in a number of dialogues with big tech company over the years, including as lead investor for the digital rights and AI accountability engagement that we coordinate. She also led Share's efforts in filing shareholder proposals to push for more transparency and accountability for big tech. So really delighted to have Juana share with us her experience and insights, and look forward to how we plan to continue engagement using RDR benchmarks. So over to you, Juana.
Great. Thank you so much, Anita. And thanks to the Investor Alliance for Human Rights and the RDR team for inviting me to speak today. So I'm not going to go into too much depth on our organization, but in case the folks on the line aren't aware, Share is a service provider, and we represent Canadian institutional investors with more than $100 billion in assets under management on ESG matters related to their portfolios. So like Anita said, I oversee our corporate engagements on human rights, on decent work. I've really had the pleasure of leading and supporting engagements with big tech companies as part of this work. So I think, like many investors on the line today, we've been engaging with these companies to respect human rights across their value chain. The RDR index really provides comprehensive data to investors like Samantha and Leandro spoke about earlier, to really inform our engagement priorities with investee companies, particularly on material risks like risks to privacy, governance concerns, also related to human rights due diligence more broadly. So to illustrate, how we at Share are using this data in a very meaningful way, it might be helpful for me to kind of speak about our ongoing engagement that we're leading at Alphabet. So for the last 4 years, we've leveraged support from RDR and the RDR Index to really inform our approach and engagement with Alphabet on targeted advertising and human rights due diligence. So research has shown that targeted advertising technologies can negatively impact human rights. I know Samantha went into this a little bit earlier in her slide deck, and that includes violating privacy, freedom of expression, other risks like discrimination. And so, the specific indicators in the RDR index are really helpful for us as investors to really gauge how the company, also its peers, are performing, and to what extent the company is kind of exposed to these risks associated with its targeted advertising practices. So the RDR index has been leveraged in meetings with companies like with Alphabet, and Anita mentioned a few other companies that we have been a lead investor on, as well as in our shareholder proposals and exempt citations. So, as investors, we have to conduct our own due diligence in line with our fiduciary duty. So that, includes review of publicly disclosed material like company policies and practices. Data collection and internal due diligence has to be robust, comprehensive, reliable. So we actually really appreciate that the RDR index reviews hundreds of sources to really determine key recommendations for companies, as well as kind of highlight developments since the last iteration of the index. So we know, for example, for Alphabet, the RDR team reviewed over 120 sources related to the company's policies, practices, other controversies, etc. And so that kind of fed into the recommendations that are aligned with our engagement approach. So we see this resource as a really valuable tool to identify key areas of engagement, opportunities for improvement to kind of address those material risks. We also see the RDR index as a reliable tool for investee companies to really leverage in internal discussions to enhance their own approach to human rights due diligence. In terms of driving corporate accountability discussions, data from the RDR index really helps investors have a better understanding of the expectations that civil society organizations, experts on digital rights have on the largest tech companies operating at a global scale around the world. And again, like I mentioned earlier, this data is really fed into kind of the determination of key engagement priorities and questions for investee companies, because it's really important as investors to understand and have a clear picture of material and salient risks from the perspective of all stakeholders. In terms of engagement challenges that we've had with big tech companies, I think the RDR index actually does a really good job at highlighting some of those challenges that investors face, particularly in relation to governance. So I know in the summary of the 2025 RDR index published by Jan, he mentioned that some aspects of the tech titans' structures and operations seem nearly impervious to change. Particularly companies like Meta and Google continue to exercise absolute decision-making power through super voting shares that allow them to overrule any dissent from their chosen directions by their company's investors. And so we continue to see this in our own engagements with companies as an issue with companies like Alphabet, where progress from our engagements are really hindered by the dual class share structure that exists. So just to illustrate kind of how engagement has been really helpful in the sense related to governance concerns, in terms of our engagement with Meta, since 2021, we've been engaging alongside a group of other investors, engaging Meta on board oversight and governance reforms. So last year, Share, on behalf of our client, the United Church of Canada Pension Plan, filed a shareholder proposal requesting that Section 5 of Meta's corporate governance guidelines be amended to add that both the chairperson and the lead independent director shall have the ability to include items on the agenda independent of the other, aka requesting Meta to give the board's lead independent director the additional power to add items to the company's board meetings agenda, even if the CEO objects. So with this shareholder proposal, we received almost 60% of support from independent shareholders. And, with this proposal, it seems like a small, fairly obvious amendment to the board's powers, but it would have a significant reform because it would mean that even in a situation where, one person is a CEO, board chair, controlling shareholder in the company, that the board could still exercise some independence in deciding what gets its attention. So subsequent engagement by Share following the shareholder proposal successfully prompted the board to commit to and amend its corporate governance guidelines to reflect this change that we requested. So Meta's new corporate governance guidelines were amended as of February 13th of this year and reflect this change that we requested. We as investors continue to have serious concerns with governance at Meta and at other big tech companies, as I mentioned earlier. But, as long as the dual class share structure persists, true board independence is impossible. That said, allowing the board to really set its own agenda is still a valuable reform. And so leveraging the RDR index in terms of research on governance related to board oversight is also helpful to guide some of the priorities in this area, as we see it as a pervasive issue across big tech. So hopefully that's helpful in terms of kind of some of our priorities related to digital rights and human rights due diligence, and how we leverage the RDR index to guide some of our engagement priorities. So I'll pass it back to Anita. Thank you.
Thanks so much for that, Juana. And I mean, it's really interesting to learn about how you and other investors have to get quite creative in trying to find ways in which we can get some independence into the board where there are issues relating to dual class share structure, an issue that continues to plague in big tech, and really applaud your continued persistence on engagement also on the targeted advertising issue. So thanks so much for sharing that. And you talked a lot about how the RDR data helped to drive those engagements. And I wanted to get Leandro or Sam to really maybe help to show the audience how you were able to access this data. The RDR has a data explorer that makes it easier to navigate the results. And it'll be great, Leandro, if you can come back on to really share with us how it is easy to utilize the data. So Leandro, are you able to get back on? You can't enable your video. Let's see. Let me see. How do we do that?
There we
Excellent.
go.
Okay, great. Thanks. Sorry about that.
No worries. I think that's working well. Yeah, so I can share my screen and do a bit of a walkthrough to the data explorer that my colleague Samantha was alluding to in her presentation as well. So when you go to the Big Tech Edition landing page, so you can see the URL here, and of course we'll share with everyone, with all the participants afterwards as well. So when you go to the landing page, you'll see here on the right that we have a direct link to the Data Explorer. There's a few ways to access like the different features that we have in this edition. So one is through this specific link, but also if you go to the top, you have also quick links here at the top. And I just wanted to do a quick mention to two things. So we have the Data Explorer, which is the one that I'll be showcasing right now. Also the indicators, which is the one that you saw in the slides, and I can also show it quickly. But then, more importantly, when you go to sort of like maybe specific indicators that you're interested in and want to take a look at specific sources or the specific assessment that our research team did on that indicator, you can access the entire data set from this edition by downloading the Excel file from our website directly. So this will open up a pretty sizable spreadsheet with all the companies, with all the indicators. So I really encourage you to take a look at that. It takes a bit to sort of like get familiar with it. I won't be showcasing it today, but that's going to give you sort of like the most granular data about the sources and the assessments. But let's go to the Data Explorer, and just to give you what's available online. And we love to see sort of like this tool as a way for you to have a very quick overview of what's happening with one company. So you can see a couple of things here. So the first one at the top, it's the performance both on at the company level and also at the services level. So here's one aspect that we mentioned in the presentation, that we assess all of these companies at the group level when it comes to the corporate governance indicators, but particularly on freedom of expression and privacy, they are assessed at the services level, right? So what that means is that when you go to each of these companies, you'll see here all the specific services that we assess and how they perform. Here, for example, this is their total score for these services. But here you can filter, for example, only for well, governance. Again, it's at the group level, freedom of expression indicators, or privacy indicators. And you can basically take a look at the entire list of the 43 individual services that are assessed. So this is just one quick way of first getting a sense of which services are assessed with the indicators, but also enabling these sort of comparisons. For example, when you want to take a look at how maybe Alphabet compares to Meta, then you can also filter and have a quick look at those specific services from these two companies. So this is just one of the first features that I wanted to showcase. If you scroll further down, you'll find what we call lenses. Lenses are basically different thematic grouping of indicators. So you'll see under each of the thematic lenses the list of the specific indicators that we believe represent that specific group, right? So from the whole list of 58 indicators, which ones are better used to represent this specific theme. So when it comes to algorithmic transparency, you have here quite a combination of elements from corporate governance aspects, freedom of expression, and also privacy. So there's a mix, and you'll see this across the different themes that the lenses cover. What's really interesting about these lenses is that it gives you sort of like quick look as well on how companies do, again, on very key themes. So we already highlighted algorithmic transparency and targeted advertising in our presentation just a few moments ago. But there's some others that you may find interesting, like digital security, which I was mentioning earlier. We cover things like encryption, vulnerability disclosure, data breaches. So all of those indicators are sort of like merged in this theme. Policy enforcement, data handling, and so on. So this is another really exciting feature that hopefully will give you a nicer overview of the themes that we cover through the indicators. And also here you can also sort of like filter different companies for your convenience. And something that we've also been doing, for a few years, it's the year-on-year comparison and so like tracking the performance over time. And we're tracking it from 2017 onwards with, again, some caveats in 2020, as this has been moments in which we have sort of like modified and expanded the methodology. So that's why we're not tracking, for example, the first edition in 2015 here in this specific chart. So there are some caveats to this performance year over year, but hopefully, and this is also another really exciting aspect of this edition, is that we haven't done any modifications to the methodology used in the 2025 Big Tech edition. It's the same methodology that we've been using since 2020, the last time that we introduced new indicators and a revised methodology. So you have effectively 3 editions of like one-to-one comparisons in performance. So that's also something that I think it's worth emphasizing that you may find useful. So besides these features, I also wanted to showcase going more specific, like more granular. You can also access the data on an indicator level. So what that means is basically you can see here the whole list of all the 58 indicators across the 3 measurement areas, and you can basically pick any of these indicators. Let's go, for example, with human rights impact assessments. And if we go on this one specifically about governments and regulations, we can take a look at you can find the usual description of the indicator. Also, importantly, the specific questions that are assessed of that indicator, for that indicator, and the performance of all the companies, and as you know, the level of transparency on these questions. So you can see here the granularity across all of those specific questions. So all of these elements which comprise the specific indicator, right? So whether there are no disclosures, whether there's a partial or a yes, and how that may be compared to the different companies, and also the different services that we assess for that company. So this is sort of like the most granular data that you can get online, so through our website. But again, for example, if you go to the Excel file that I was mentioning earlier, you'll be able to find for this indicator, as well as for all of them, but taking this example, you'll be able to find, for example, for this question about if the company assesses how laws affect freedom of expression information in jurisdictions where it operates, you'll be able to find the specific source and our assessment, so like the written analysis and the justification effectively for our answer here in this case, and the scoring. So I can pause here, leave it at that. Hopefully this is useful to give you an overview of how to navigate the website. But yeah, happy to take any questions later during the Q&A as well if there are remaining doubts about it.
No, thanks so much, Leandro. I think it was really useful for you to actually just showcase it so investors and other folks can really go in and realize that, that there are so many levels in which they can get the granular detail. So thank you for that. And I'm going to invite all the panelists back on. So if you can turn on your cameras, and also to invite Jan Ridzak, who is the digital sector transformation lead at the World Benchmarking Alliance, and who I've worked with over the past 5 years to join us to take questions and answers. So Jan and Sam, I think Aditi might have to help them restart their videos. And maybe, yeah, that's great. Great to see you then. Maybe let's hit some of the questions. I'm just trying to see if Sam is able to join us too. I'm going to ask one of the general questions. The RDR index highlights varied performances amongst tech companies regarding transparency and respect for digital rights. What structural or governance factors most contribute to these disparities, and how can investors effectively discern between what is a genuine commitment to human rights or just a tick in the box exercise, so superficial compliance? Maybe someone from the RDR team can jump in on that one.
I can take a first stab at it, and then I'd love to pass it on to my colleagues to complement. I was thinking specifically, I think when it comes to discerning between genuine commitments and superficial compliance, one of the aspects that are really interesting from the methodology are the questions about how companies actually implement a lot of these standards that we track. And I think that's the area where it's, I think, the most challenging to get very detailed answers from companies. There's often, and you can see this also when it comes to AI and the current sort of like AI, hype cycle in terms of companies maybe boasting about having AI principles, but then they really fell short of demonstrating how they actually implement that they protect human rights through the development and use in the case of the RDR methodology, for example, in the context of algorithmic systems, right? So I would point to maybe having more insight into that implementation aspect and how companies demonstrate or not that implementation. But I feel like another really great point was raised by Juanita when it comes to the structural aspects in these companies related to voting structures. I feel like it's part of the whole the whole problem. But I'd love to hear what Jan, Sam, and Juana think about that as well.
Sure. And in that context as well, I was just going to chime in that we also had a question, which, is along the same aspects of this is, how does the data really assess outcomes, right? That the tech companies are taking, vis-a-vis these policies and processes. So not just, again, superficial compliance, but really implementing it, the point that you picked up on, Leandro. But yes, Juana, did you want to go next? I see you've unmuted.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Thank you, Anita. And I think just adding to what Leandro said, I wholly agree with what he shared. I think more broadly, companies, including all big tech companies, have a responsibility to respect human rights under the United Nations Guiding Principles for Business and Human Rights. And so that's the authoritative standard for these companies to do so. And as investors, when we see the difference between a company checking and ticking a box versus actually respecting digital rights, is when we see that disparity between what's happening on the ground versus what their stated commitments are. So, for example, with Alphabet, they have a formal commitment to the UNGPs through their human rights statement and policy. That being said, when we look at their actions, they're backtracking in terms of their approach, commitment to responsible AI, as well as kind of the limited disclosure, as we're seeing through the RDR index, on what they're doing around human rights due diligence of things like targeted advertising, right? So we're seeing kind of a difference between what their stated commitments are versus what's happening on the ground. And that's leading to more risks that we're seeing related to whether it's regulatory, reputational, legal, financial risks. And so that type of practice really indicates to us as investors that there's gaps in terms of where they're actually respecting digital rights and where there's kind of gaps and concerns that investors have an opportunity to address.
Thanks for that. And Sam, as you're answering the question as well, I wonder if you could sort of also address the issue of new legislation that's coming in and, to really improve, how does that kind of legislation play a role in improving company performance? Just trying to get through to the questions, noting the shortage of time.
Yeah, no, definitely. One thing to add quickly to what Leandro and Juana had said is engagement, I think, is also an important indicator on how companies are wanting to do in practice. Because in my experience, you see, I guess companies can say a lot in their reporting. And if you're not looking at a lot of these reports, or it might be the first time you're looking at them, you might be unsure about greenwashing. But when companies actually want to interact and acknowledge that they have some areas to improve upon, or they want to ask questions, that starts to be an indicator that this company can recognize that there's some places they might be falling short on and wants to open that discussion to work to improve them. That's not the case often. So that's also an indicator that things might be going in the right direction in terms of what they're doing in practice. And then thinking about the legislation that's happening. So it's not only companies, but also at the country level where we're starting to see some backtracking or even hesitation in terms of legislation, whether it's on digital rights, AI, or even sustainability. More and more we're seeing governments moving towards this idea that regulation stifles innovation and might have negative impacts for business. At RDR, our work shows that that's not the case. There's scope for regulation that doesn't stifle innovation, because once you have digital rights measures in place, that means that you're considering people's safety, how comfortable they feel using the products that you provide. And that can lead to more people opting in to participate in the tech ecosystem because they feel safer. There are many more reasons why regulation is a good thing, but that's just one example.
I was just going to throw it to Jan to just make a couple of comments. I know you answered the question relating to, global majority versus the Western countries, the issues of choices and democratic values across the piece. Maybe you can just highlight a couple of pieces quite quickly, because I'm just noticing the time, and I wanted to throw to Juana the last question as well before we wrap up.
Sure. Thank you so much, Anita, and thank you again for organizing this this wonderful conversation. I think beyond what Leandro and Samantha and Juana have highlighted, I would say that there is if there's one thing that I would sort of flag in the newest results, is that there are quite a few sort of pendulum swings, and that sort of manifests itself in many ways, and sort of speaking indirectly to some of these questions. There was a question that I saw about Chinese companies, and where is their progress concentrated, and I would like to sort of emphasize that there's progress in sort of numbers and scores, but then of course it's concentrated in specific areas. So in the context, I think it was Matthew who asked of censorship demands and transparency on that. That is still very much in a very opaque zone, right? So none of the Chinese companies are transparent on that particular issue, which, as many of you recall, drove the downgrading of several of the Chinese tech giants 3 years ago. So there was no progress on that front, even if in some of the easier areas, perhaps, those companies have progressed. There's a lot more that we could unpack, but I know that we have 2 minutes left, and I'd be happy to pass it on to Juana. Thanks.
Okay, great. No, thanks for it. And, I just wanted to throw to Juana, there was a question about shareholder leverage, what are the tools? And Juana shared some great examples during her presentation, but I just wanted to throw it to you, Juana, in terms of what you are currently working on. What are some of the tools that you are using right now?
Yeah, thank you so much, Anita. In terms of escalation, so as I mentioned earlier, we are engaging with Alphabet on targeted advertising. So on June 6th is Alphabet's 2025 AGM. And so we have a proposal on the ballot requesting the company to conduct a human rights impact assessment of their targeted advertising technologies. And so this proposal has been co-filed by 10 institutional investors across Europe and North America. And the lead filer is Share on behalf of our client, the United Church of Canada Pension Plan. So this is the 4th year in a row where we're filing this type of resolution. But again, as other folks on the line have mentioned, I think we're seeing momentum in terms of regulation, but also a need for companies like Alphabet that rely so heavily on targeted advertising to ensure that there's robust due diligence. So that proposal will be on the ballot next month. Thanks, Anita.
No, that's great. And I have this 1 minute to wrap up to thank my wonderful panelists for all the information that they've shared, really providing, real data that applies in the current environment. Really wanting to thank all of you for joining us for this discussion, and any of the investors who are interested in participating in engagements with the big tech company, please reach out to me. The Investor Alliance is going to be using this 2025 data to continue the engagement with big tech companies, and we're really looking for more investors to join that effort. So again, thank you to the wonderful panelists, and thank you for joining us, and bye everyone.